I was stress eating a stolen dinner roll in a back hallway of the fanciest hotel in Atlanta when the most powerful man in the city walked up and asked me if I was okay. I did not know who he was. He did not tell me. And by the time I found out, I had already laughed with him, argued with him, and felt something I had absolutely no business feeling on a work night. What happened after that changed everything I thought I knew about myself, about men, and about what it feels like when something is real. This is that story. Welcome to our channel, where we bring you emotional stories that stay with you. If you're new here, hit subscribe and the notification bell so you never miss a story. And if you're returning, thank you. Your support means everything. Now, stay until the end, drop a comment with your thoughts, and let's begin. My name is Naomi Calloway, and I have been coordinating events in Atlanta for 11 years. I have planned galas, weddings, corporate dinners, product launches, and one extremely chaotic quinceañera that I still do not talk about. I am good at my job. I am very good at my job. I show up early, I leave late, I anticipate problems before they happen, and I do not eat during events because there is never time and also because it looks unprofessional. That last rule is the one I broke the night everything changed. The Hargrove Foundation Gala was the biggest event of my career. When my agency landed a contract, my boss called me into her office and said, "Naomi, this is a one. You do not drop the ball on this." I smiled and told her I never dropped the ball. I meant it. The Hargrove Foundation raised money for education programs across Georgia. Every year, they held a gala. Every year was elegant, well-attended, and perfectly organized by someone else. This year it was mine. The budget was larger than anything I had ever worked with. The venue was the Grand Monarch Hotel in Midtown Atlanta, 16 floors of marble and chandeliers, and the kind of carpet that makes you feel guilty for walking on it. I had been at that hotel since 7 in the morning. It was now 9:45 at night. Everything had gone wrong in a way that only expensive events can go wrong quietly, expensively, and all at once. The floral centerpieces for Table 9 arrived with the wrong flowers. The sound system cut out during the welcome remarks and came back 30 seconds later, like nothing happened. One of the catering staff spilled an entire tray of champagne glasses, and we lost $400 of glassware in about 2 seconds. The keynote speaker showed up 40 minutes late because his driver took him to the wrong Monarch Hotel. And to be fair, there were 2 of them. By 9:30, the event was back on track. Guests were eating. The band was playing. The auction was running smoothly. My team had everything covered, and I was in a back hallway behind the kitchen with my heels in my hand, and a dinner roll I had grabbed off a passing tray, sitting on the floor against the wall like a woman who had completely lost her dignity and was perfectly fine with it. I did not care. I was starving. I had not eaten since 6 in the morning. I had my earpiece in, but the chatter had gone quiet. My assistant Bria had things handled in the ballroom. I had maybe 10 minutes before I needed to be back out there for the auction close. 10 minutes to sit on this cold floor and eat this dinner roll and remember why I love this job. I was on my 3rd bite when I heard footsteps. I looked up. A man was walking down the hallway toward me. He was tall, dark-skinned, broad to the shoulders, wearing a deep navy suit that fit in the way expensive suits fit men who never had a thing about money. He had a neatly trimmed beard and the kind of face that made you look twice, not because it was pretty, but because it was interesting. Strong jaw, calm eyes, the look of a man who was never in a hurry because he never needed to be. He slowed when he saw me. I looked down at my dinner roll. I looked back up at him. He said, "You good?" Just like that. Not "excuse me" or "pardon me" or any of the polished language that belonged in a hotel like this. Just "you good." I said, "I work here. This is a professional break." He looked at my heels sitting next to me on the floor. He looked at the dinner roll. He looked at my face. Then he leaned against the wall across from me and slid down until he was sitting on the floor too. I stared at him. He said, "I needed to get out of there for a minute too." I said, "Sir, this is a staff hallway." He said, "I know." I said, "Guests are not supposed to be back here." He said, "I know that too." I did not know what to do with that, so I just took another bite of my dinner roll and stared straight ahead. He loosened the top button of his collar. Just one. He leaned his head back against the wall and let out a long, slow breath, like he had been holding it all night. Something about that exhale felt real, not performed. Like this hallway was the first place all evening where he did not have to be anything for anybody. I watched him for a second. Then I said, "Long night?" He said, "The longest." I said, "What do you do?" He paused, just a beat too long. Then he said, "Real estate mostly, some other things." I said, "Mostly?" He smiled, not a big smile, just a small one at the corner of his mouth. He said, "It's complicated." I said, "Okay, Mr. Complicated Real Estate." He laughed at that. A real laugh, not a polite one. It came from somewhere genuine and surprised both of us, I think. He said, "What about you?" I said, "I made all of this happen." I waved my hand toward the direction of the ballroom. The flowers, the food, the band. The fact that the microphone came back on like nothing happened, that was me. He raised an eyebrow. He said, "The speaker was late." I said, "That was his driver." He said, "The centerpiece on table 9 is wrong." I sat up straighter. I said, "How do you know what the centerpiece on table 9 is supposed to look like?" He said, "I notice things." I studied him. Something about the way he said it was not arrogant. It was just true, like noticing things was simply how he moved through the world, and he had never thought to apologize for it. I said, "You're very observant for a man sitting on a staff hallway floor." He said, "And you're very calm for a woman whose event just had 4 things go wrong." I said, 5? You missed the champagne glasses." He said, "I didn't miss it. I just didn't want to pile on." I laughed before I could stop myself. And then we were both laughing in this empty hallway with the muffled sound of the band playing somewhere behind the walls, and it felt easy. Easier than anything I had felt all day. Easier than most conversations I had with people I had known for years. We talked for a while after that. He asked me how long I had been doing events. I told him 11 years. He asked me if I loved it. I thought about the professional answer. Instead, I said, "I love it when it works. Right now it's working, so tonight I love it." He said, "Honest." I said, "I'm always honest." He said, "Nobody's always honest." I said, "Okay, I'm honest when it counts." He said, "Better." I asked him where he was from. He said Memphis originally, but Atlanta for the last 12 years. I told him I was from right here, born and raised in Southwest Atlanta, when the Spelman built everything I had in this city. He said, "Spelman woman." I said, "Is that a problem?" He said, "Absolutely not. My mother went to Spelman." I said, "Smart woman." He said, "The smartest person I have ever known." The way he said it made me stop. There was something in his voice when he talked about his mother, soft and certain at the same time, like she was the ground that everything else was built on. I recognized that feeling. My grandmother had been that for me before she passed. That one person who makes the whole world feel like it has a floor. I looked at him differently after that. My earpiece crackled. Bria's voice came through. "Naomi, auction's wrapping up. We need you for closing coordination in about 5 minutes." I pressed a piece and said, "Copy. I'm coming." I started putting my heels back on. He stood up and straightened his jacket. I said, "Back to the real world." He said, "Unfortunately." I stood. In my heels, I came up to about his chin. He looked down at me with that same calm expression, and there was something in his eyes I did not have a word for yet. Something like recognition. Like he was looking at someone he had been expecting, and was not surprised she had finally shown up. I stuck out my hand. I said, "Naomi Calloway, best event coordinator in Atlanta." He shook it. His hand was warm and steady. He said, "Elijah Hargrove." I smiled and turned to walk back toward the ballroom. Then I stopped. I turned back around slowly. I said, "Hargrove." He said, "Yes." I said, "As in the Hargrove Foundation." He said, "Yes." I said, "As in the man whose name is on every single piece of paper I have signed for the last 4 months." He said, "That would be me." I stood there with my clipboard against my chest, staring at the man who had spent 20 minutes sitting on a hallway floor next to me while I ate stolen bread, and complained about champagne glasses. He was not a guest at this gala. He was the reason the gala existed. I said, "You let me talk to you like that." He said, "I enjoyed every second of it." I said the only thing I could think of. I said, "Your table 9 centerpiece had white lilies. It was supposed to have white orchids. I'm sorry about that." He said, "Naomi?" I said, "Yes?" He said, "The only thing at table 9 I care about tonight was whether the event coordinator was okay." Then he walked back toward the ballroom like he had not just rearranged something inside me. I stood in that hallway for a full 30 seconds before Bria's voice pulled me back to earth. If you're feeling this story, hype it so others can find it. Comment where you're watching from. Now back to the story. Part 2. I coordinated the closing of that auction like a woman who had not just discovered she had been sitting on a hallway floor eating stolen bread in front of one of the most powerful men in Atlanta. I smiled. I directed. I spoke into my earpiece and moved my team like chess pieces and made sure every single thing landed exactly the way it was supposed to. Nobody in that ballroom could have looked at me and known that my heart was beating slightly faster than normal, or that I kept catching myself glancing toward the main table, where Elijah Hargrove sat at the center of everything like he had always belonged there. Because he had. He literally had. The gala ended at 11. Guests filtered out slowly the way people with money do. Stop and take photos and say long goodbyes and finish conversations that could have ended 20 minutes earlier. My team broke down stations, collected linens, accounted for every rental item. I was on my feet until midnight going over the vendor closeout checklist with Bria. Bria was 26 and sharp, and she noticed everything. So, of course, she noticed me glancing toward the lobby for the 3rd time in 10 minutes and said, "Who are you looking for?" I said, "Nobody." Check the floral count again. She checked it. Then she said completely casually, like she was reading off a grocery list, "The tall man in the navy suit asked about you." I looked at her. I said, "What?" She said, "About an hour ago. He came up to me and asked if the event coordinator was still on site." I said yes. He said thank you and walked away. I said, "That was the client, Bria." She said, "I know who he is, Naomi." I said, "So you know that was a completely normal question for a client to ask." She looked at me with the face young people make when they think you are being ridiculous. She said, "He didn't ask how the event went. He didn't ask about the budget or the vendors or the centerpiece situation. He asked if you're still here." I had nothing to say to that, so I told her to go recount the linens. I was in the lobby at 12:15, rolling my coordinator bag toward the exit, when I heard my name. I turned around. Elijah Hargrove was standing near the lobby seating area. He had taken his jacket off and was holding it over one arm. His collar was still open at that one button from earlier. He looked like a man who had spent 4 hours being impressive for a room full of people and was finally done performing. He said, "You're leaving?" I said, "The event is over. My job is done." He said, "Did you eat anything tonight?" "Actual food, not dinner rolls." I said, "That dinner roll was perfectly adequate." He said, "Come on. The hotel restaurant is still open for another 45 minutes. Let me buy you dinner." I looked at him for a long moment. I thought about all the reasons this was not a good idea. He was a client, a significant one, the kind of client whose foundation could send 10 more contracts to my agency if tonight stayed professional in his memory. Getting personally involved with him was the kind of thing that complicated business relationships and made people talk and created situations that were very hard to walk back from. I thought about all that clearly and rationally. Then I thought about the way he had slid down that wall and sat on the floor next to me like it was the most natural thing in the world. I said, 45 minutes. He smiled. That small corner of the mouth smile. He said, "That's all I need." The hotel restaurant was the kind of place where the menus had no prices on them, which always meant the prices were somewhere between alarming and criminal. We were seated in a quiet corner booth. The restaurant was nearly empty. A few couples finishing late dinners. One group of businessmen at the bar nursing drinks and talking too loud. The waiter came. Elijah ordered without looking at the menu, which told me he had eaten here before many times. I ordered the shrimp and grits because I was from Atlanta, and I knew a good shrimp and grit situation when I saw one. He ordered sparkling water. I ordered sweet tea and watched him notice that and say nothing about it, which I appreciated more than I expected to. The food came and we talked. He told me about the foundation, how his mother started it 15 years ago after his younger brother struggled to access good schools growing up in Memphis. How she built it from a small neighborhood tutoring program into something that now funded scholarships and after-school programs across Georgia, Alabama, and Tennessee. How she passed it to him 4 years ago when her health started declining, and he promised her he would not just maintain it, but grow it into something that lasted beyond both of them. I said, "Is she still with you?" He said, "She is. She's stubborn as anything. She's going to outlive every single one of us, and she knows it." I said, "Good." He said, "She would like you?" I looked up from my plate. He said it simply, not as a line, not with any kind of performance behind it, just a quiet, straightforward statement like he was noting something obvious. I said, "You don't know enough about me to say that." He said, "I know you've been on your feet since 7 this morning running an event for over 1,000 people, and your only break was 10 minutes on a hallway floor. I know you apologized to me about the wrong flowers before you said a single word about anything else. I know you told me the truth about your job instead of giving me the polished version. I know your team looks at you like they would follow you anywhere." He paused and looked at me directly. "My mother respects people who work like they mean it. She would like you." I sat with that for a moment. Then I said, "You were watching me the whole night." He said, "I told you. I noticed things." I said, "That's slightly alarming." He said, "Probably." I said, "Why were you really in that hallway?" He was quiet for a moment. He picked up his water glass, turned it slightly in his hand, and set it back down. Then he said, "Every year we do this gala. Every year I stand in that room and shake hands and give the speech and make all the rounds, and it all matters. I know that it all goes to something real and something my mother built. But some nights a performance of it catches up to you. I just needed 5 minutes where nobody was looking at me like I was supposed to be something." I understood that in a way I did not expect to. I said, "And then you found me eating a dinner roll on the floor." He said, "Best part of my entire night." I laughed. He laughed. The restaurant was quiet around us, and outside the floor-to-ceiling windows Atlanta glittered and moved the way it always did. The city going about its business, completely unbothered by the fact that something was shifting in a corner booth on the ground floor of the Grand Monarch Hotel. We stayed past 45 minutes. The waiter cleared our plates and brought dessert menus, and neither of us mentioned leaving. I ordered sweet potato pie because it was on the menu, and it would have been wrong not to. He ordered nothing but watched me eat with an expression I could not fully read. I said, "Stop looking at me like that." He said, "Like what?" I said, "Like you are trying to figure something out." He said, "Maybe I am." I said, "And?" He said, "I think I already figured it out." I set my fork down. I looked at him directly. I said, "Elijah, I am your event coordinator. Tonight was a professional engagement. I appreciate dinner, but I need you to be straight with me about what this is, because I do not do complicated, and I do not do situations that are going to make my professional life harder." He did not look away. He did not get defensive or pull back or give me a smooth, rehearsed answer. He just held my eyes and said, "You're right. I hear everything you're saying. I am not trying to make anything complicated for you. I just did not want you to leave yet." The honesty of it landed somewhere in my chest that I was not prepared for. I said, "That's a very straightforward thing to say." He said, "I told you I'm not complicated." I said, "You literally told me earlier that you were complicated." He said, "The real estate is complicated. I am not." I looked at him for a long moment. This man who owned buildings and ran a foundation and sat on hallway floors and watched me with quiet, careful eyes like I was something worth paying full attention to. I said, "I have to go home." He said, "I know." I said, "I have a debrief with my agency at 9 tomorrow morning." He said, "I'll walk you out." He did. We walked through the lobby together. The night staff moved quietly around us. At the front entrance, the Atlanta night was warm and thick the way summer nights in the South get, heavy with heat even past midnight, the air sitting on your skin like it has nowhere else to be. My car was in the parking structure across the street. I turned to face him on the sidewalk. I said, "Thank you for dinner." He said, "Thank you for the best conversation I've had in a long time." I said, "You need better conversations in your life." He said, "I'm working on it." I started to turn, and he said, "Naomi." I looked back. He said, "Can I call you?" Not my agency, not my coordinator line, me personally. I reached into my bag and pulled out a business card. Instead of handing it to him, I took his hand and pressed the card into his palm and closed his fingers around it. I said, "That's my direct line, not the agency number. Mine." He looked down at his closed hand, then back up at me. I said, "Good night, Elijah Hargrove." He said, "Good night, Naomi Calloway." I walked across the street and did not look back, because I knew if I did I would find him still standing there watching me go, and I was not ready for what that would do to me. I know I was right not to look back, because Bria, who had been waiting in the parking structure the whole time and saw everything from the upper level, told me the next morning that he stood on that sidewalk until my car pulled out of the structure and disappeared into traffic. She said, "Naomi, he stood there the whole time." I told her to mind her business. She said it again. The whole time. I poured my coffee and got ready for my 9 o'clock debrief and tried very hard not to smile. I failed completely. He called on a Tuesday. Not a text. An actual phone call, which already told me something about him. It was 4 days after the gala, and I had spent those 4 days being completely normal and professional and not checking my phone any more than usual, which was a lie I was telling myself and doing a poor job of it. I was in my car outside a venue. I was scouting for a November corporate dinner when my phone rang, and his name came up on the screen because I had saved his number the morning after the gala, and I was not going to apologize for that. I let it ring twice, so it did not seem like I was sitting there waiting. I picked up and said, "Naomi Calloway." He said, "You saved my number." I said, "I save all my clients' numbers." He said, "I'm calling from my personal cell." I said, "I know." There was a pause, and then he laughed quietly and said, "How are you?" And just like that, we were back. The same easy back and forth from the hallway, from the restaurant, from the sidewalk. We talked for 40 minutes sitting in my parked car outside a venue. I completely forgot to go inside and scout. He told me about a trip he was taking to Houston the following week for a foundation board meeting. I told him about the corporate dinner I was planning and the client who kept changing the color scheme every 3 days. He said that sounded exhausting. I said it paid well. He said that was a very practical answer. I said I was a very practical person. He said he was starting to understand that about me. Before we hung up, he said, "When I get back from Houston, will you have dinner with me? Not a hotel restaurant this time. Somewhere you choose." I said, "That sounds like a date." He said, "It is a date. I'm asking you on a date, Naomi, clearly and directly, so there's no confusion." I appreciated that more than he knew. No games. No pretending it was something casual, when it was not. Just a man saying plainly what he wanted and letting me decide. I said, "I'll think about it while you're in Houston." He said, "Fair enough." He came back from Houston on a Friday. I texted him that Saturday morning with the name of a restaurant in Old Fourth Ward that I had been wanting to try for months, a small Southern fusion place that had been written up everywhere, but still somehow felt like a neighborhood secret. He texted back 2 words. "Saturday night?" I said 7 o'clock. He said, "I'll be there at 6:50. He was there at 6:45. I saw him through the window when my Uber pulled up already seated, no phone in his hand, just sitting there calm as ever like a man who had never been anxious about anything in his life. He stood up when he saw me walk in, and the way he looked at me in that moment, like I was exactly what he'd been expecting, and he was glad to be right, did something to my composure that I had to actively manage. We ate and talked for 3 hours. The food was incredible. The conversation was better. He told me more about growing up in Memphis, about his mother raising him and his brother mostly on her own after his father left when Elijah was 9, about how watching her build something from nothing with no safety net, and no one handing her anything was the reason he worked the way he worked and gave the way he gave. He said she used to tell him that everything you build on a Hargrove Foundation lasts. Everything built on shortcuts falls. I told him about my grandmother, about how she raised me while my mother worked double shifts and how she used to make a full Sunday dinner every single week without fail oxtails, collard greens, cornbread, macaroni and cheese, sweet potato pie, and how the whole extended family would come through, and the house would be full of people and noise and food, and how that feeling of a full table was the reason I got into events in the first place. I wanted to create that feeling for people for a living, a room full of people who were glad to be there. He listened to all of it the way he did everything, completely, quietly, without interrupting, like what I was saying was worth hearing every word of. At the end of the night, he walked me to my car. We stood in the parking lot in the warm Atlanta night, and he looked at me for a long moment, and then he said, "I want to keep doing this." I said, "Dinner?" He said, "You? I want to keep doing you in my life. Getting to know you, seeing where this goes." I looked at him standing there in the parking lot light, this man who had more money than I could imagine, and sat on hallway floors, and called instead of texted, and showed up at 6:45. When he said 6:50 and listened like listening was a skill he had actually worked at. I said, "I want that too." He stepped closer, close enough that I had to look up to hold his eyes. He reached out and very gently tucked a curl behind my ear, and his hand stayed there at the side of my face, warm and steady. And he looked at me like I was not a surprise to him at all, like I was something he'd been certain about since the moment he slid down that wall and sat on the floor next to a woman eating a stolen dinner roll and decided she was the most interesting person in the building. He said it quietly, almost to himself, like he was finally saying something out loud that he had been thinking for weeks. He said, "I knew you were mine from the first night." I did not say anything for a moment. I just stood there in that parking lot in the Atlanta heat with his hand warm against my face and the city moving around us and something settling inside me the way things settle when they finally land in the right place. I said, "You're very sure of yourself." He said, "No, I'm very sure of you." And there was nothing I could say to that, so I didn't say anything. I just leaned into his hand slightly, the way you do when something feels like home and you stop fighting it. He smiled, that small corner of the mouth smile that I had been thinking about for weeks without admitting it. We stood there for a while longer before I finally got in my car. I drove home with the windows down and the Atlanta night air coming through and something warm sitting in my chest that I did not try to name or analyze or talk myself out of. Some things you just let be. Some things you just let be. What would you rate the story? Drop 0 to 10 in the comments right now. If this story moved you, hit subscribe for more emotional journeys every day. And if it truly touched your heart, consider leaving a super thanks. Your support helps us create more stories like this. Every contribution, big or small, means a world. Ready for the next story? It's even more dramatic than this one. Click now. Thank you for being part of this journey.